The latch dropped behind us like a decision I hadn't been allowed to make. Our first night. My husband stood with his back to me, one hand flat against the wall, the other holding the lamp low. I waited for him to turn, to be tender, to be something. Instead, he spoke to the wall, slow, like a man reciting a prayer he did not fully believe. He gave me one rule, just one, and the way he said the word "here" made my stomach go cold and small. I kept that rule for 6 hours. Then, before the sky turned gray, I broke it. And what I saw through that window unmade, everything I thought I had married. My name is Miriam. I grew up in a small Schwarzentruber settlement outside Clark's Mill, in a stitched-together corner of Pennsylvania nobody puts on a map, and I was 22 the night I stopped believing that obedience and love were the same thing. This channel is where I tell the truths we were taught to swallow, quietly, one story at a time, the way we should have been allowed to speak them long ago. If you know what it is to be handed a rule on the very day that was supposed to be yours, sit with me a while. Subscribe, not because I'm asking you to leave anything behind, but because some of us were never given a room where we could say these things out loud. And tell me in the comments, when did you first sense a man was protecting a secret and calling it your duty? I read every one. Every single one. Now let me take you back into that room. The room smelled of fresh-cut pine and a stranger's soap. Eli had built the bed himself. Everyone said so at the supper. Proud men clapping his shoulder like the wood proved something about him. Now I stood beside that bed in my nightdress, with my hands folded the way I'd folded them my whole life, waiting to be told what came next. His boots sat by the door, still dusted with the day's field dirt. My shoes sat beside them, smaller, newer, 2 pairs, side by side, like a picture of a marriage. I remember thinking that. I remember thinking how quiet a room can be when 2 strangers are told they belong to each other. Hours before, there had been singing, the long benches, the low German hymns, the women pressing my hands and calling me a bride with wet eyes and warm palms. My mother had held my face and said God was good. I had believed her. That was the strange thing, the thing I keep turning over even now. I was happy that afternoon. I walked into that house believing a door was opening, not closing. The warmth of the day was still on my skin when the latch fell. And then the warmth was gone, all at once, the way heat leaves a stone after the sun goes down. Eli did not come to me. I had braced myself for that, for the nearness of a man I barely knew, for whatever a wife was supposed to give and endure. My mother had told me almost nothing, only that a good wife submits and does not ask, so I stood ready to submit. But he stayed by the wall. He set the lamp on the sill and kept his hand pressed flat against the boards as if he needed them to hold him up. His shoulders were high and tight. A man does not stand like that on the night he has waited for. A man stands like that when he is afraid. There was a window on the far wall, and over it a plain dark shade, pulled all the way down. I noticed it the way you notice a thing your eye keeps returning to without permission. The lamp threw a soft yellow square onto that shade, and the square trembled a little when the flame moved. I don't know why it held me. Maybe some part of me already understood that the room had a fourth wall I wasn't meant to look through. Maybe I only tell myself that now, after. but I looked at that shade more than I looked at my new husband. I have thought about why, and I still cannot say. When Eli finally spoke, he did not use my name. He said, "There is something you must promise me." His voice was low and careful, each word set down like a man laying eggs into a basket. He started, then stopped. He drew a breath and started again, and stopped again. Twice he opened his mouth and gave me nothing. I have watched grown men lie to a bishop's face with less trouble than Eli had, saying this one plain thing to his own wife. And the longer he struggled, the more certain I became that whatever came next would change me. I just had the wrong idea about how, because I thought it was about my body. God forgive me. I thought he was working himself up to tell me something a husband demands, some hard rule about what a wife owes in the dark. My whole life had prepared me to expect that the difficult words between a man and a woman would be about touching, about duty, about the parts of myself I had been taught to be ashamed of. So I stood there bracing for a demand I dreaded. My hands were cold. My heart was loud. I was ready to bow my head and say yes to a thing I did not want. That is what obedience had made of me. But it was not that. It was never that. He turned his head just enough that I saw the side of his face, and the lamplight caught something wet at the corner of his eye, and he told me the rule must hold until the sun was fully up, not part of the way. Fully up. He said it twice, that phrase, until the sun is fully up, as though the daylight itself were the thing that mattered, as though morning would set us both free from whatever this was. I did not understand. I nodded anyway. I had been nodding at men my entire life. Then he said it. He looked at the dark shade and not at me, and he said, "Do not lift that shade until sunrise, no matter what you hear outside." And he blew out the lamp before I could answer, before I could ask a single thing, so that his rule was the last thing in the room, and then there was only the dark and the smell of pine and the two of us breathing. No matter what you hear, not see, hear. He had said hear, and that one small word settled into my stomach like a swallowed stone, and I lay down in the black beside a stranger, and I began, without knowing it yet, to listen. Eli's breathing slowed and deepened long before mine did. I lay on my back with the quilt pulled to my chin and my eyes wide open in the dark, learning the shapes of a room I would be expected to call home. The rafters were only a darker black against the black. Somewhere below, the house ticked and settled the way new houses do, wood easing into itself. My husband slept the sleep of a man who had unloaded something heavy, turned away from me, one arm thrown over his ear as if even in sleep he did not want to hear. And I understood then that whatever was coming, he had chosen to sleep through it and leave me awake with his rule. I want you to understand what kind of woman I was that night, so you'll know why I stayed still so long. I was raised to keep rules the way other children are raised to breathe. When I was small, I asked once why the women ate after the men, and my father did not strike me. He only looked at me with a tired disappointment that was worse than any strike, and my mother pulled me from the room by my wrist. I learned the lesson well. A good girl does not ask why. A good girl assumes the why is holy, even when it feels like a hand on the back of her neck. So I lay there, obedient, telling myself the shade was nothing. The first sound was almost nothing. A gate, I decided. the pasture gate lifting on its hinge, the way a gate does when the wind leans on it. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Wind. Of course, a farm at night is never truly silent. There are animals shifting, timbers cooling, the small conversations a place has with itself in the dark. I told myself all of this in my mother's voice, the calm, certain voice she used to close a subject. I even smiled a little at my own fear. I was a bride jumping at gates. That is all it was. I was so sure that is all it was. The second sound did not let me stay sure. Footsteps. Not the wander of an animal, but the deliberate weight of a person. Slow, moving along the side of the house, beneath the very window I had been forbidden to open. One, then another, then a pause, the kind of pause a body makes when it stops to listen the way I was listening. My whole skin went tight. I lay rigid and counted my own heartbeats and told myself a hired man, a neighbor, a drunk from the next farm over, anything, any story but the one my body already believed. The footsteps moved to the corner and stopped, and in the quiet after them, I heard the house holding its breath with me. I began to say his rule to myself like a prayer. Do not lift the shade, no matter what you hear. I said it the way I'd said the German prayers as a girl, not for meaning, but for the shelter of the words, the way a rule can be a wall you hide behind. But even as I said it, a small, terrible question was working itself loose inside me, and once it came loose, I could not put it back. Why would a husband forbid me to look? Not to touch, not to leave, not to speak, to look. A man only covers a window when there is something on the other side of it he cannot afford for you to see. If you have ever lain awake next to someone you were promised to and felt the promise turn to a locked door in your chest, stay with me. I know how it sits in the body. That is the reason I tell these nights at all. Then came the third sound, and it was not the wind, and it was not a stranger. It was a voice, a woman's voice, low, out in the yard. Careful the way you are, careful when you do not want to wake a house. She was speaking. I could not catch the words at first, only the shape of them, the rise and fall of someone pleading softly. And then, clear as a bell struck once in a cold room, she said a name, not mine, a woman's name I did not know, spoken by a woman I could not see. In the dark yard beneath the window my husband had sealed against me. My hand was moving before I decided to move it. Up, toward the shade. I pulled it back. I pressed it flat under my own body to keep it still. She spoke again, closer now, just under the sill, and this time the name she said was his. Eli, soft, familiar, the way you say a name you have said 1,000 times in the dark, a name that belongs to you. Beside me my husband stirred. His breath caught, then broke into a murmur, thick with sleep, and he answered her. He said a name back into his pillow, low and tender, a name that was not Miriam, a name I had never once heard him speak, and something in me that had spent 22 years folding its hands finally, quietly refused. I would not lie here blind until the sun came up. Whatever waited on the other side of that shade, I had to know it before the light did its work. I turned back the quilt. The floorboards were cold as well water under my bare feet. I moved the way you move in a house you don't yet know, one hand out for furniture that wasn't where I expected it, my heart so loud I was sure it would wake him. Behind me, Eli breathed on, sunk back into whatever dream held that other name. Each step toward the window felt like stepping out of my whole life. I had never in 22 years done a thing I'd been plainly told not to do. Not once. And here I was, crossing a dark room to break the first rule my husband had ever given me, on the first night he had a right to give me one. My knees shook. I kept going. I reached the window and stood with my palm against the shade. It was stiff cloth, cheap and new, and I could feel the cool of the glass behind it, and beyond the glass the faint gray that comes before gray, the sky thinking about morning but not yet willing to commit. I told myself I would only lift a corner, just enough, just to prove to my own foolish heart that there was nothing out there but a neighbor and a gate and my own bridle nerves. My fingers found the bottom edge. I stood there a long moment, longer than I want to admit, my whole body begging me to lie back down and stay a good wife. Then I lifted it, only an inch. Through that inch I saw a lantern. It sat on the ground in the side yard, and its light made a small warm circle on the frost-stung grass, and at the edge of that circle stood a pair of feet, bare feet, like mine. I lifted the shade another inch, slow, and the feet became legs, and the legs became a plain dark dress, and the dress became a woman. She stood very still, facing the house, her hands cupped low over the front of her body, the way a woman stands when she is carrying a child and has begun without thinking to hold it. My breath fogged the glass. I wiped it with my sleeve. I could not stop looking now if the house had caught fire around me. I lifted the shade the rest of the way, and I saw her face. She was young, younger than me, I think, though sorrow can age a face or spare it, and hers had been spared. She was looking up at my window as though she had known all along which window it was, as though she had stood in that yard before. There was no rage in her face, and somehow that was the worst of it. There was only a deep, worn-down grief, the grief of a person who has already done all her crying and has come now only to stand witness to a thing she cannot stop. And I understood, without a word passing between us, that she was not a stranger to this house. She belonged to it in a way I did not. I want to tell you I understood everything in that moment, but I didn't. My first thought was jealousy, plain and ugly and human. My first thought was that my husband had another woman and had hidden her behind a shade on our wedding night, and I felt the floor of my new life drop away. It took a few slow breaths, standing at that cold glass, before the truth reordered itself into its real and heavier shape. The rule was never about my body. It was never even about her. The rule was about time. He had needed the dark to last long enough for someone to come and take her away before I ever knew she existed. The shade was not a wall. It was a clock. She was to be gone before the sun was fully up. That was the whole of it. That was why the daylight mattered so much to him that he said the words twice. There were people in this, there had to be, hands that had arranged my wedding not as a beginning but as a covering, a clean new marriage laid over an old wound like a fresh quilt over a stain. A young woman carrying a child, and a community that had decided, in rooms I was not allowed into, that the answer was to marry the man off quickly to a girl from another settlement who knew nothing, and to move the problem out of the yard before morning. I was not a bride, I was a solution. If you have ever discovered that a thing done for you was really done to you, if you have ever learned that your place at a table was carved from someone else's loss, tell me below. I need to know I am not the only one who found that out standing at a cold window. I read them all. The woman in the yard lifted her eyes and found mine through the glass. For one long moment we simply looked at each other, two women held apart by a pain and a rule, and the decisions of men we had both trusted. She did not look away, neither did I. Something passed between us in that gray almost light, something older than shame. Not forgiveness, not blame, just the plain hard truth of being seen by the only other person who knew. Then, behind me, the bed creaked. Eli's voice came thick and rising out of sleep. Miriam, and I heard him sit up. And I heard him see the pale square of window glowing where the shade should have been, and I heard him understand. The sun was not up, and I had already broken his one rule. For a moment, none of us moved. Eli sat upright in the tangled quilt. The woman stood frozen in her circle of lantern light, and I stayed pinned between them at the glass, the shade bunched in my fist. 3 people held in a single held breath. I could hear my own pulse. I could hear the lantern's small hiss out in the cold. I had imagined, in the seconds it took him to wake, that a man caught this way would come at me with anger, that the rule broken would bring down the wrath I'd been raised to fear. I braced for it the way I'd braced for everything, but when I turned to look at my husband, there was no wrath in his face at all. There was only terror. He was not afraid of me. I understood that quickly. He was afraid of what my knowing would cost. And not only him. He came off the bed and to the window in his nightshirt, and he did not grab me or strike me or raise his voice. He looked down at the woman in the yard, and something broke open across his features, something I had no name for then and have a hard name for now. You weren't supposed to see, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word like a boy's. Not, how dare you, not obey me, only that. You weren't supposed to see. As if the seeing were the sin, and not the thing I had seen. And here is what I have carried all these years, the part I most need you to hear right. I do not think Eli was a wicked man. I have wanted to hate him. It would be easier, cleaner, to make him the whole story's villain and be done. But he was 24, and he had been handed a rule too, by men older than him in a room he could no more argue his way out of than I could. He had been told this was mercy, for the girl, for the child, for me, for the good name of everyone. He believed it the way I believed my mother when she said God was good. We were both obeying. We were both afraid. The hands that built that night belonged to neither of us. He asked me, quietly, to keep it. That was the whole of his plea, standing there in the gray. Not to unsee it, he knew that was gone, but to hold it the way he held it, to fold it into myself and never let it out. For her sake, he said, and nodded toward the yard, and I think he even believed that was true. Say nothing, and it stays buried, and the girl and her child go somewhere safe, and we go on. It was the same rule dressed in daylight. not don't look anymore. Now it was don't tell. The shade had come down over the window. Now they wanted it down over my mouth. And I stood there and understood that a marriage could be a shade too. Out in the yard, the woman had heard us. She did not wait to be sent for. She bent, slow and careful, and lifted her lantern. And before she turned to go, she looked up at me one last time. I will never forget what she did then. She did not glare, and she did not weep. She lifted one hand, palm open, and held it toward my window for the space of a breath. Not a wave, not quite. A greeting and a goodbye, and an apology and a blessing, all in one open hand, from one woman to another across a frozen yard. I pressed my own hand to the cold glass to meet it. Then she was gone into the dark between the barn and the road, and the lantern light went with her, and the yard was only frost. And then, as if the world had been waiting for her to be gone, the sun came up. It came the way it always comes, without caring, a thin gold line along the top of the far field, then more, then the whole cold morning washed pale and ordinary and bright. This was the light Eli had wanted so badly to reach. This was the moment his rule was meant to deliver us into. Clean, the night's business finished in the dark, where such things are kept. But the daylight did not hide anything now. It showed me the flattened grass where she had stood. It showed me my husband's wet face. It showed me exactly what I had married. The mourning that was meant to bury the truth was the very thing that made me able to see it whole. I did not scream, and I did not weep. Something quieter than either was happening in me, down where the folded hands live. I understood, standing in that first hard light, that every kindness done for me the day before had been part of the covering, the singing, my mother's warm palms. God is good. All of it laid gently over a girl in a yard, so that I would never ask. They had not married me to Eli. They had married me to a silence, and made me its keeper before I even knew there was anything to keep. And I understood one more thing, the thing that has never left me. The rule was never truly about the window. It was about making sure two women never looked into each other's faces and learned the truth at the same time. So I made a choice, not a loud one. I turned from the window and I said to my husband, plainly, I will not pretend I didn't see her. I did not know yet whether I would stay or go, whether I would speak it to the whole settlement, or carry it careful and quiet for years. That came later, and it is its own long story. But I knew, in that lit room, that I would not be a shade pulled down over another woman's life. It was the first thing I had ever decided for myself. My voice shook. I said it anyway, and somewhere behind my ribs, for the first time in 22 years, my hands came unfolded. I stayed, at first. I want to be honest with you about that, because the stories we tell about leaving often skip the long middle where a woman is still inside the thing. I did not run that morning. I made breakfast. I set 2 plates. I moved through the motions of a wife while something new and awake moved through me underneath, watching, remembering. That is what breaking one rule does. It does not free you all at once. It only teaches your hands that they can come unfolded, and after that you cannot fully forget the feeling. I carried the girl in the yard inside me like a coal I would not let go cold. Some mornings the not forgetting was the only brave thing I did all day. I looked for her.